Gatewood Wealth Solutions. Welcome to our weekly market commentary broadcast. Joining me remotely today is Aaron Tuttle, our Chief Investment Officer. Aaron's going to talk with us today about what's on most people's mind, which is the elections, and how is the outcome of these elections going to impact portfolios and the markets going forward. As we said last week, the race is much closer than what we believe is being portrayed in the polls. And so Aaron's going to dig deeper today to help us to understand where the polls or where the candidates may actually stand as of today. Now, of course, all this is going to be changing because there's a lot of campaigning going on and there's still time for people to vote before and on election day. The other thing that's in the news, of course, is the coronavirus cases. They're surging again. We're starting to see more lockdowns here, both nationally and across the world. How is that going to impact the recovery? Are there changes that we're going to be making to the portfolios because of this new condition that we're facing with this increase in cases? So Aaron is going to inform us more and hopefully give you a better idea of where we stand today and what we believe will be happening over this next week. Thank you, Aaron.
John, thank you for the introduction. And why don't we just start where we always start, at the coronavirus timeline. We continue to see the fourth quarter information or data come in that supports the thesis that industrial activity would rebound. We'll actually get into GDP numbers later on in the call, but things are looking promising, but we are always cautiously optimistic, especially when it comes to the money supply numbers, another item that we'll be covering. But this week, being that we are just 7 days out from the election, actually 6 days out from the election, we will focus on the battleground states after spending some time on just polls last week. So let's look at those 6 states as a battleground state, because these are the ones that are going to matter. We vote a president in based on the electoral college vote. Doesn't matter the popular vote. So let's look at those critical areas. So that'll be Arizona, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Florida. Down here at the bottom right corner, we can see the battleground state as polled together. And for the last couple of weeks, Trump is actually doing slightly better than his position going into the election whenever it was Secretary Clinton. Now that it's Vice President Biden, he has been doing slightly better, but the last couple of weeks has actually showed that Biden has improved on where Secretary Clinton was in this time in 2016. Nonetheless, we do believe it's going to be a very tight race despite the polls, which we went over that last week. So let's get into it. One thing that is new this election is the vote by mail. And there is also in-person voting. Vote by mail, whenever we poll, or other polling agencies, I guess we don't poll anybody, will determine that Democrats are more likely to use vote by mail than Republicans. However, there is another option, especially in the state of Florida, and that is in-person voting or voting early. And if we look at vote by mail on the left, we can see that, sure enough, the Democrats are doing better in the vote by mail turnout. And if we look at the in-person voting, as in voting early, the Republican registered Republicans and registered Democrats, we don't know what they actually chose on their ballot, are turning out for in-person voting. Now, one of the caveats here is that because of the vote by mail lead and the large amount of Democrats that were taking up that option, there was a movement within the state of Florida to get out the vote early at the early vote, which may cannibalize some of the Republican votes that were anticipated at on election day. So we'll get into that in a little bit on why that's important. So if we look at the 2016 results, and this is from New York Times, has the election results from 2016. It's a great website and great information. We can see that Donald Trump won the state of Florida by 113,000 votes. And we're going to spend a little bit of time here on the Miami-Dade County. it had a very large Democratic lead. Now, it was not the highest. If we wanted to go to the highest, we'd go to the Gadsden County, which is up near Tallahassee. It's just adjacent to the state capital. But it was still pretty high. I think it was 68 versus 60, or 63% for Miami-Dade. There it is right there in front of me. So once again, I want to put that disclaimer whenever we get into here. So the 2016 results, those are actually Republican and Democrat votes. When we start to look at comparisons on turnout in the early voting, we don't know what their actual vote is. It's only their party affiliation based on the registered vote. There are plenty of Republicans that are going to vote for Biden, and there are Democrats that are going to vote for Trump. Just because they show their party affiliation as Democrat or Republican doesn't mean that that's what the actual vote is. So take everything with a grain of salt, like always on this. So let's look at voter turnout whenever we start to adjust for just early voting. And we're going to get into the information for Miami-Dade. Now, this information changes all the time and is being updated whenever we first wanted to look at this because of that movement of Republicans pushing out the early vote, which is probably cannibalizing some of the later vote. The Republicans actually had a pretty big jump ahead of where the Democrats were. And the narrative is the Democrats are going to have a lead coming out of early vote, and they do. It's just not nearly as large as it was in prior years. So if we look at early votes in 2016, Clinton had 63%, while Trump had 34% in 2016. Right now, the Democrats have 43% and the Republicans have 30%. What we're not counting or taking in consideration is the non-affiliated parties because we don't know what they're going to vote yet. But if we start to look at the difference relative to 2016, it appears that President Trump, by voter registration, has an additional 16,000 vote lead of where we were in 2016. Now, that doesn't mean that this is actually going to translate into anything, but if we start to look at what is the polling of who is going to show up, it is 58% of the Republicans or 35% of Republicans are likely to vote on election day, where only 10 to 15% are going to vote, that are Democrats are going to vote on that day. So if that math is correct, the Republicans can come back from about a 600 vote deficit out of early votes and still easily win the state. And when we look at just comparison on a benchmark to benchmark, it does appear that President Trump is ahead in the Florida votes. Once again, there's a lot of assumptions there. One, it assumes that the voter registration is going to correlate with the voter, who they vote for. It also is anticipating that there is going to be a large amount of Republicans that show up on election day that we haven't, or the Republicans have not cannibalized their election day votes, and they are not in Florida, or not being counted, and that's the reason they're ahead. And there's going to be a similar turnout. But when we look at the data, it does appear on the ground at the moment, President Trump has a lead relative to where the 2016 election was at this time. So we're going to put this, when we start to model these out, we're going to put it in the column of President Trump victory. And it's important because this is a state that President Trump has to win. If he doesn't win it, you could probably just turn your TV off early on and go to bed knowing that there will be a President Biden. This is a very crucial state for him to win. So now let's move on to North Carolina. And President Trump received almost 50% of the vote in this state. Secretary Clinton had 2.19 million, where President Trump had 2.36 million, and his lead was about 173,000. From that, it probably is safe to say that without major changes in the way you voted in 2016, that President Trump is likely to carry the state. Now, here I'm going to go into this map, And it's doing the same comparison where it's looking at early voting, whether in person voting or vote by mail. And if we look at this, now this is a right leaning, actually probably heavy right site that we're looking at. Now it has Biden 0.8% above where Secretary Clinton was in 2016. So it right now looks like Biden has made some inroads. Is it enough? Probably unlikely, but there is a slight advantage over where Secretary Clinton was in. But remember, this is also a state that Republicans are counting on an election day turnout. So just having a slight advantage at the moment is not significant enough to overcome what is expected at the end. But how many of these are being cannibalized? There doesn't seem to be a big push like there was in Florida to try to keep the spread low, where they cannibalize election day votes. Now so we looked at a right-leaning map. Let's look at a provider that's a little bit more left-leaning. This is Target Smart. It's a Democratic political data service firm. They do deep dives across all the counties. It's a great site to try to understand what data is coming in and what it looks like in real time. They do have this thing called a modeled party. So we could look at just registered Republican, registered Democrat, and then unaffiliated parties. But that's not as foretelling as if we were to look at the model. Now, the models are going to be based on different polls, and et cetera. And we've continually to say that the polls are not a very good, accurate predictor. I've heard that it used to be prior to 2010 that you would have a 50% pickup whenever you would phone somebody for a poll. And now we're down below 2%. So that's certainly a biased sample, and it would not be statistically significant. So take this also with a grain of salt on the model party. But it shows that, and I know this is a little bit of a quirky way of looking at the data. It has Democrat, Republican, and then unaffiliated. And the Democrat has 3 columns. The medium dark blue is at 53.7%, and the very dark blue is at 49.7%. Only pay attention to those columns. Don't look at that color in the middle. And then the Republicans also have the same color scheme. So what we're doing is the medium color blue, we're comparing that to the medium color blue for Republicans. And there was a 53.7% turnout for Democrat registered voters at this time, while the Republicans had 42.1%, or they had about an 11% lead. Now, if we look at 2020, which is the dark blue, we see that there's 49.7% of the vote coming in under Democrat registered voting, and then 44.1% for Republican registered. So that lead has been reduced down to just 5%. So that indicates that North Carolina, based on Target Smart's information, is tending towards the favor of President Trump on winning the state. Now let's move on to Pennsylvania. Now, Florida was a must-win, and I would even throw in North Carolina as a must-win for President Trump. Pennsylvania is a must-win for Biden, and Trump won this state by 44,000 votes in 2016. Now, since then, the Republicans have gained an additional 166,000 registered voters over the Democrats. Now, Pennsylvania, the voter turnout is about 27.6%. I think this slide's a little bit dated. I pulled some new numbers earlier, and we have about 1.7 million votes that have been cast. So Pennsylvania is that state where the vote by mail narrative is playing out as expected. The Democrats are significantly ahead of Republicans on that turnout. And last in 2016, it was much lower, where we had 42% of the early vote for Democrats and 48% for Republicans. So at this time in 2016, the Republicans were actually ahead. But whenever we look at the polling of how voters plan to vote in November in the state of Pennsylvania, 52% of the Democrats plan to vote by mail, or about 1.5 million. Once again, I looked at the numbers today. We're at 1.7 million. Well, 84% of Republicans are going to vote on election day. So that would give us about 475,000 votes. So we're at 1.7, we're approaching that 1.9, which is expected by polls. But that doesn't say anything about the unaffiliated independent voter, which 58% of those independent voters say that they have a preference for voting on election day. Now, if in-person voting is an indication that you're likely to vote for Trump, then that means that the more independents are going to go for President Trump than Biden. But really, when we look here, it's really difficult to tell on what direction Pennsylvania is going to go there's just not a clear-cut edge on this because the data just isn't that great. And we do have that vote by mail scenario. Now, there were things that probably didn't help Vice President Biden during the debate, where he said that he would try to end over the long term fossil fuel dependence, and that's not going to go well in the state of Pennsylvania. Once again, the registered voter has gone towards the Republicans over the last several years. But I would not say that it's going to go to the Republicans just because of all those facts. We just don't know. The data is just, it doesn't say that there's a clear leader here. So Wisconsin, those three other states I think were critical. I'm just kind of going to run through these pretty quickly here. Once again, we're looking at model data. So this is trying to assume where these independents and unaffiliated voters are actually going to land. And if we look at the 2016, Democrats led the Republicans 50 to 37.5. So they had a lead of 13.1% at this time. The model has just 3.7% lead over the Democrats at the moment of this slide, whenever we captured the slide. Once again, this data does change often. So that does show favor for President Trump for Wisconsin, that it could go his way. If we look at Michigan, Michigan has about a 3% lead in 2016. This time, based on this data, it's closer to 5% for Democrats lead. So Biden is doing a little bit better than Hillary Clinton in 2016. Let's move on to Minnesota. The lead is slightly higher, both with Republicans and Democrats. But notice that unaffiliated voter has increased since 2016. Hillary Clinton only carried the state by 43,000 votes in 2016. And there has been a lot of things that have happened there. We've had a lot of riots and protests. That law and order candidate may resonate with a lot of these areas that have gone through that. In addition, up in that northeastern part known as the Iron Range, we've had several mayors flip their party affiliation from Democrat to Republican. Now, if you look at that, that is like an industrial base. It's not a very heavily populated area in Minnesota. So it alone, if they took all the votes, I don't think they could close that 43,000 vote gap, and they certainly won't get all of them in those counties. But it could help, and we can see that the manufacturing, those areas that Trump seems to have done well and realigning to his, maybe not the Republican Party, but at least to his candidacy. Those high school educated rural whites, typically union voters, they at least feel that their lives have been improved by his policies. But then if you throw in the law and order component within those key areas of Minneapolis and Rochester, if there's just some movement towards, and Trump carries those previous things, he can close the gap here. So that is why we're looking at the state and saying it is up for grabs in this election. Arizona, now here it's going the other way. Historically a Republican state, and it's the state of Barry Goldwater, and it is no longer a sure thing for the Republicans. It is not necessarily likely to go red. And if we compare it in the same way that we were on the previous states where we're benchmarking, it looks like Biden is doing better than Secretary Clinton was in the state, and that this state may be turning blue. Now, I did watch or look at I think it was watch, there's so many YouTube videos now, on some polling that was done for the state. And one of the things that they did was they added a couple of questions trying to find out if you were a first generation, second generation, or third generation plus voter within the state. And surprisingly, the first generation voters were more likely to be registered Republicans. So it's probably individuals coming out of California and moving to Arizona, and they may be people that already have conservative views. It's a question that we've been asking in the investment committee as this change in the large population states, these movements away from New York, from San Francisco, from LA towards other states, Texas, Arizona, Florida. What would that do to the electoral map? So based on this poll, the majority of people that are leaving those states and are coming into Arizona are actually more likely to vote Republican than Democrat. Also, the third generation or greater, they were also more likely to vote Democrat. So it's the second generation that seems to be moving towards blue. And that second generation, oftentimes an immigrant generation, are moving into the professional class. And the professional class seems to be, at least in this election cycle and the previous, there's been this movement where if the more educated you are and the more credentialed you are, the more likely you are to vote for the Democrat ticket. That is the area that is turning blue based on this poll. So we thought that was interesting. So we're going to go ahead and attribute this state where we gave the edge of North Carolina and Florida to President Trump. We're going to go ahead and try to offset some of that component by saying, well, let's make this state a Biden win, put that in his column. So here is where we're starting off. We think Florida is likely to go for President Trump. Once again, if it doesn't, you can turn your TV off. You probably have a President Biden. He also needs to get North Carolina. Both of those states do look like they're going in that direction. But if we're wrong on one, we're going to give Biden the state of Arizona to try to handicap against being wrong in there. And we can see that we just have a few other states to pay attention to. And we think Pennsylvania is the one that we really need to pay attention to, because if Biden loses Pennsylvania, it is really difficult for him to pull out electoral victory. It's not impossible if he has Arizona, but just consider Pennsylvania a must win. So if Pennsylvania goes for Trump, and we've seen Florida and North Carolina, things are not looking great for a President Biden. So here's an example. Biden could maintain most of the Great Lakes states, and if Trump just wins one and not winning Arizona, he would President Trump would be he would have a second term. Now, if he doesn't win all three, and Biden does have Arizona, that gets him there, 271. So it is crucial for Biden to win Pennsylvania, but if he can take Arizona, it is not necessary. There is an alternate path if he wins Arizona besides just Pennsylvania. So then let's look at that without Arizona. So then you would see that Biden absolutely needs to win Pennsylvania, and he could probably afford to lose one of the Great Lake state battleground states because he would still have that magic 270. So let's go here where Trump wins Pennsylvania and then loses the other Great Lakes states, maintains Arizona. That would be a victory for Trump. So that's how important Pennsylvania is to Biden. If Florida had gone the other way, I don't think there's any way that Trump really could get. It would be very difficult for him to carry those other states if he can't carry Florida. Now, there is the nightmare scenario. So if Nebraska, the extra electoral vote was picked up by Trump, And then we have Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Florida going for Trump, but then Arizona, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. You could have a 269 to 269 tie. It's probably unlikely, but man, would that be a nightmare scenario. So the point of going through this is to not be able to predict. We don't know. We think this is very close. We don't think the polls are accurately predicting the outcome. We think this election is close and that there is a very high likeliness of a contested election. So we continue to have that baseline scenario of a contested election that we may know. We may have an election in 6 days, but we may not know who is going to be the president in 6 days. So we are continuing to have the portfolio structured with this scenario. So let's move on to the other big news item that is capturing headlines this week, and that is the surge in coronavirus new daily cases. We certainly see a large increase here. We're up 40% versus 14% in the 14-day average on deaths. So there's a lot more new cases than there are daily deaths, and that number on average is fairly low. Now we hate to see a 14% increase. So what does all this mean? Well, one, look at the slope of the growth in the new cases on this recent surge. It is sharp, but it's not nearly as sharp as the previous two. That means the growth rate is a little bit slower, and that's probably because we have people that are less susceptible. And the death rate has not been near comparable on that growth rate. So here we're removing the time lag. We can see that the lag it took from the previous surge to finally seeing deaths increase. We're well past that time, but we are seeing it. Now, it's important to note that we are seeing an increase in deaths. That is the ultimate litmus test on whether the coronavirus is actually expanding. I've seen responses or tweets from President Trump saying it's all because of testing. It isn't all because of testing. If it was all because of testing, you would continue to see a decline in death rates. Doesn't mean that it's that the amount of tests that are happening is not showing up in a greater amount than the deaths. That certainly could be the case, but the coronavirus is spreading. It's important to look at where it is spreading because it really is in that colder climate, northern Midwest states. That's where that red is. It's not on the coast. That means that areas that have already been hit are not having a second wave. And we can see that if we start to look at the states where there's hotspots. So North Dakota, South Dakota, Wisconsin, Montana, all are very high up on the list. Haven't gone through the first surge or even the second surge with the Sun Belt, and we'll look towards the bottom. Maine, Vermont, Hawaii, New Hampshire, District of Columbia, New York, Oregon, Washington, Maryland, California. These are all areas that have already been hit, and they are the areas where we're not seeing a resurgence. Now, one, these are the areas are rural and they were late to be hit, but they're also cold, and we think that's relevant. Here is a region of China. China has actually just recently detected 137 new asymptomatic cases in Kashgar, which is that part of that northwestern region of Xinjiang. I'm sure I mispronounced it, and Tao will help me with the pronunciation later. This is near the Himalayas. This is going to be a cold environment also. And remember, the coronavirus showed up very early on in China. So the seasonality seems to be in play. And we're wondering if there's a second wave coming in China now that it's getting cooler, yet to be determined. We were critical and pushed back on President Trump's response, saying that it's all cases, but we will agree with Dr. Atlas on just the positive note that we are seeing on a ratio basis, the number of deaths versus the number of cases have been continuing to decline. Now, there are a lot of reasons why this could be. It could be that the virus is mutating and becoming weaker. It could be that those people that were the health spectrum on the margin. And now that they have passed, unfortunately, from the coronavirus, we have a healthier society that seems to handle that better. It could be one of the reasons that the flu, we're just early on in the season, and there's a significant decrease in the amount of flu deaths so far. One, we're early on in the season. Two, that may not be the reason. We are still social distancing. I think people are better at washing their hands. So there's all kinds of reasons that could point to why this is the case. But it is still a promising thing to see lower death rates per the number of cases. And remember, on average, the daily case average is the highest we've ever seen it in the country at the moment. Yet our death rate is much lower than it was back in the height of the first surge. So that is promising news. The Eurozone has surpassed the United States on the amount of daily new cases as well as daily new deaths. So they are having a little bit more trouble this go round than the United States, and that's because they were a lot more strict on their lockdown procedures initially. But it seems that that may not matter. At some point, the virus comes back each time you're trying to open, and it just has to go through. And we hopefully can get to the herd immunity. I know that's a controversial thing. Herd immunity does exist. It doesn't mean that there are no risks or that there are not precautions to be taken while we try to achieve that. But ultimately, that is what will prevent it. Whether that's a vaccine getting us closer to herd immunity, which would be favorable because then you don't have as near the risk of death if it is a dead virus. So that's the way that you want to get to herd immunity. But it does look like herd immunity is a lower number than often what is assumed for a virus like the measles, mumps. We need 85 to 90% herd immunity. It doesn't seem that is necessary for the coronavirus. Once again, I'm not a doctor. I'm just reporting on what we've understood the research and the data to suggest, which is corroborated here in Sweden. So we can see the death rate is almost zero in Sweden. And now, one of the reasons that it may be such a low threshold is because the coronavirus is also a cold virus. And maybe, once again, maybe there's overlap with the virus makeup so that your immune system, if it's had a cold that looked similar to this virus, it's more likely to respond. And that's, once again, a maybe. But what we can see is that Sweden's death rate, which they did not do a lockdown, they're not mandating masks, they're not necessarily social distancing at this point, but we still see a death rate declining while most of the other states or countries in the Eurozone are increasing at a rapid pace. The World Health Organization did come out and say that the lockdown should not be used as the primary way of controlling the spread of the virus. This is not them changing their opinion on the use of lockdowns at all. They continue to say that lockdowns could be necessary if the health system is being overwhelmed. So this is not to say that there would never be a lockdown again or that they gave the wrong recommendation prior. The whole thing was to flatten the curve, so they are remaining consistent with the things that they had said before. That being said, it doesn't mean that the countries and the governments are necessarily going to follow what the guidelines for the World Health Organization are. Spain and Italy, who've been hit very hard by the, whenever you look at per capita basis, are seeing a resurgence, and they are imposing those lockdowns. There's actually rioting that has been happening in those countries because of that. So just because the World Health Organization says not to do a lockdown doesn't mean we won't have one. So let's move on into the economy. The GDP on Thursday, we will see what it was for the third quarter. We expect it to be a really big number. You should also expect President Trump to tweet it out because he's going to claim that this is how well they are doing within the economy. It was more to do with the Fed's stimulus and the fiscal stimulus that came out very quickly on the rebound. And President Trump certainly was part of that process, but we got to recognize why that rallied so quick, and that was the extraordinary monetary policy, which allowed extraordinary fiscal policy. But we do expect to see around 34 to 35%. GDP now is forecasting it to be 36.2%. Once again, this comes out on Thursday. Some other promising news, at least up until the point of the coronavirus resurgence, was the TSA processed 1 million people per day over the weekend on this October 16th and 18th. So that was the highest number since the coronavirus panic started. And though it's positive and it shows signs of reopening, it's certainly still well off the 2019 numbers. They were near 2.5, 2.6 million this time last year. An area that we are concerned about is just the money supply. It continues to collapse relative to where it was. We're now at 11.5%, down from 13. And if it wasn't for the fiscal stimulus still likely to happen, probably not before election day, and then also the chance that we would have more reopening, which the stocks rallied. I'll talk about that here on the next slide. We would want to be more defensive, but there's the likeliness of those things happening is high. So we have not been rotating to a lot of defensive positions. We have increased portfolio insurance again this week because of this in a long short fund, trying to help mitigate this. And remember, we did move to 36 months of cash near the market high, but we are concerned about where the money supply is at the moment. Then if we look at the market last week, we snapped a 3-week winning streak. I think many people probably noticed it was the first time we've had a really sharp sell-off on Monday. And what worked the previous week was, as those reopening indicators signaled with the TSA 1 million, we saw casual dining picking up, a lot of unemployment dropping further. There was a reopening play that started to turn out where value started to rotate past growth, meaning a lot of the tech stocks and a lot of the growth stocks were getting sold off as airlines, transportation, hotel, casual dining, all of those started to accelerate, so that value outperformed growth. And we saw this rotation earlier this year, and we did not chase it. We're still not going to chase it. We did lose against our benchmark through that value rotation, but then we later went on to make all new highs in our spread versus the benchmark. So we're going to continue to be patient and wait for our signals. Now, Monday's sell-off, which was started and had a lot to do with the coronavirus cases increasing, took that reopening play back off. So we saw those value names actually get hit harder on Sunday's sharp sell-off. So yet to be seen what happens. We do think we're in a trading range for some time until fiscal stimulus happens, or we have a full reopen economy and the banks begin to lend. No real change in our investment thesis. About a month or so ago, we did remove commodities from our bearish stance. We had a short-term position in qualified accounts and commodities. They just haven't been working here as of late. But Goldman Sachs is now forecasting a bull market for commodities in 2021. And this really is whether a Biden or a Trump election. If it's Biden, they anticipate less investment in oil extraction. So you'll see a price in energy there, and favoring alternative energy sources. So a lot of the materials to put those in place. But even if it's not a President Biden, it's once again a President Trump, there's a lot of infrastructure spending, there's a weak dollar. So, and the accelerating price inflation, all of these things that we've talked about before, Goldman Sachs put in on their call for a strong commodities market in 2021. Looking at relative strength, mids and smalls were the place to be over the last week. Tech did weaken a little bit on some momentum. We didn't make many changes other than taking some of our small cap tech stocks that we think are a little rich and moving them to that portfolio insurance. Commodities are still below the S&P 500, but we wouldn't be surprised to see them rotate back into the portfolio at some time before the end of the year. John, I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Aaron. That was a great presentation, very informative. And as you point out, we believe the race is much closer than what the polls in the mainstream media are saying. So at this time next week, the election will have passed, and we will be presenting to you on who the next president of the United States is going to be. It may be that it's a contested race, so we may not know the actual final outcome, but we will certainly be here to keep you informed about what that may mean to the economy, the market, your portfolios, because we want to make sure that you stay well informed. So join us again next week. We look forward to having you. Thank you for joining in today. If you'd like to subscribe to our YouTube channel, please click the button down here on the right to subscribe. And we look forward to speaking with you then. Again, as always, our goal is to give you our data-driven professional view of the market and the economy so that you can sift through the noise and be better informed. Have a good day.